All right, so we are here to do the third prong in what has become our Spike Lee movie conversation trilogy. We start off with Do the Right Thing, and then we talk about Defy Bloods. And now we're jumping back to an in-between period to talk about 1992's Malcom X. And I'm here once again with Emmanuel Noisette of EMan's Movie Reviews and David Fowlie of Keeping It Real. Once again, Don Shanahan of Every Movie Has a Lesson was supposed to join us, but he was unable to make it. Partially due to the time constraints of having to watch a nearly 3.5-hour movie on relatively short notice. So I understand, and I also appreciate you guys for being able to carve that out. I personally had to watch it in two separate sittings just because of scheduling. I'm kind of glad I did that because I had a bit of a breather. It's sort of a self-imposed intermission right at the halfway point, because there's a lot to digest. I had not watched this thing in its entirety since I saw it in the theater, and 27 or 28 years ago. My God. But yeah, so it is Spike Lee's adaptation of Malcolm X's autobiography as told to Alex Haley, who wrote Roots, of course. And I don't know, as with any based on a true story film or, biopic, I never know how much of it is based on the actual source material and how far it is from the truth, how much creative license there is in it. It does feel to me like a pretty straightforward, authentically told story. If either of you have background on anything that might be have any license Lee might have taken in telling this story, please include that as we go along. But I hadn't watched this film in a long time, and I forgot just how powerful a movie it was and how much I think it speaks to the current environment we're in, possibly more so than either of the other two films that we've discussed in this series, and I think we'll get into why. So before we get into it, I think I'd like to get just kind of around the table here what people's high-level opinions of the movie are. I mean, we're talking spoilers, of course. If you haven't watched the movie, you can check it out now, free on Netflix. They're doing a Black Lives Matter showcase of various films centered on African American issues and personages. So definitely check that out. But EMan, why don't we start with you? What did you think of Malcolm X?
Well, I mean, this was absolutely a Spike Lee joint, right? This is one I think this is one of his defining pieces. It's a perfect combination of where, he happens to find that amazing talent in Denzel Washington, who puts on a award, worthy performance. I still think he should have won the Oscar that year, but the thing that I love about this the most is that it really felt, whether it's accurate or not, because I haven't done my own research enough to confirm, what was exaggerated or whatever, excuse me, or embellished. This felt fair. It felt like a fair historical depiction of a historical figure that's pretty famous. This didn't feel watered down. It didn't feel as though it was, just trying to be a puff piece in a sense about Malcolm X. And I think that it's one of those things that makes me long for other biopics to do the same thing. If you're gonna show me somebody, show me all of them. Show me their good sides, their bad sides. Like, I want to see the full picture, so that we can really absorb the person, what they accomplished, where they came from. And I think Spike did a really good job in showing us that. I mean, in the first third of the movie, we see, Malcolm is, Malcolm Little. He's a hustler, he's a street guy, he's a con man. He's going from one thing to the next. And what that does is, and what the little bit of insight I started again watching it now versus when I watched it, like in the 90s or whatever, late 2000 or early 2000s. it really gave me a much better understanding of how he was able to come to the mental shifts, not just one, but multiple mental shifts. And I loved how, and I think that's the importance of showing his whole story, because it's not easy to really show someone who's made a monumental impact on society how they've come to the point to get to these mental paradigm shifts in their life. And, you know, because that's just as important as whatever messages that they're trying to communicate, right? I mean, he was a very lost person. He was going back and forth, just looking for anything. He finds that figure in jail. You know, he drinks the Kool-Aid. You know, he's all in on the whole thing. And then later on, you see he goes through yet another, you know, shift once he makes the travel to the Middle East and all that. And, you know, again, it's just one of those things where I just thought it was just captured beautifully. Like, I really felt the humanity in the person, rather than him just feeling like a historical figure that we happen to cherry pick quotes from or read in a textbook, you know, once in a blue moon every on February or whatever. So, you know, overall, I thought it was shot very well as well. I love the cinematography in it. I really started to pay a little bit more mind into that. You know, I can't speak to whether this was the case or not, but I got the feeling that Denzel kind of had, you know, the leash was taken off, so to speak, for him to just go, just do whatever he needed to do, say whatever he needed to say that was in tune with the character. And, you know, I really felt like Denzel lost himself into the character so much that you end up just believing like that really is Malcolm X, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, overall, I mean, it's a fantastic movie. It is lengthy, you know, it's not something I would, you know, put down and, you know, try to go watch again anytime soon, but that doesn't mean I appreciate it any less. It's definitely fantastic. It's definitely worth a watch. As to whether or not it impacts today's climate, I we'll talk about that later, but I'm a little iffy on that right now. I still got to kind of think on that. But overall, fantastic film. You know, just great.
Yeah. Cool. David.
This is probably my first time seeing it all the way through.
Okay.
For whatever reason, when it came out in '92, I never saw like the whole. I didn't see it in theaters. I never saw the whole thing. I think what I remember most about it is the marketing. Like X was everywhere, right? And I was pretty impressed with the marketing. But you know, I'm glad that I don't know. I don't think the David from 1992 would have really gotten into this as much as I do now. You know, you mature in a lot of different ways as a moviegoer and as an and somebody who appreciates film and film studies. And I think not just because where we're at in 2020 and everything, but knowing film references and film capabilities, I have a lot more. I think me today, I have a lot more respect and appreciation for what Spike Lee did with this film, and I'm glad it's on Netflix for people to check out. I would imagine this is a pretty good next step for people who never saw Malcolm X, the movie, after watching, say, something like The Five Bloods. You know, that's I would imagine that Spike probably had some kind of a deal. It's like, all right, well, I'll do The Five Bloods, and then, you know, when it gets released, how about some more of my movies out there? It's as far as what you said at the tail end there, EMan, about whether it has a relevance to today. I think it's a good. If people who haven't seen it, it's a good. It's good to add some context to what's going on. I think, and I think it is interesting to have a 3.5 hour movie about Malcolm X, and we never had really a movie at that length about, say, MLK. I think that would be interesting too, but I think that this Malcolm Little story is very intriguing. Just his journey is really compelling. It's emotional. And I think, Spike just really gets everything. I mean, the time period, the feel of, like, there's moments where you're just like inside Malcolm X's head. When he's thinking back about, when his parents' house caught on fire and everything, and his relationship with his mom and with his father, and what happened, with all that in his childhood. That obviously shaped who he was, and it is interesting to see how he was shaped throughout his journey, and who he was shaped by. And yeah, I agree with you, man. This is a tour de force for Denzel. He should have won the Oscar. It's crazy he didn't. It's a lot of movie. It is. It's I don't really care too much about length that often. If the movie's compelling, if it's engaging, and if I have the time, man, you got me. And Spike had me. It is interesting to see it now, and then see, like, certain, let's say, younger actors, or back then younger actors, show up. You get a little bit of Halle Berry, a little bit of Michael Imperioli, and it's like, whoa, wait, what's Robert Schiff? What's going on here? Richard Schiff, sorry. But it is interesting to see, like, certain people, back in 1992, let's say, show up in this movie. It's like, oh, okay, she looks a little different. But I was really impressed with everything about this movie. About it just seems like a huge undertaking to adapt this autobiography, and to the way in which he looked at Malcolm's life. There's some decisions that had to been made, and I think you could probably look at this movie like in thirds, maybe. The crime part of Malcolm Little, with what was Spike's character's name?
Shorty.
Shorty, yeah. It's Shorty, and hanging out with Shorty, getting in trouble, going to prison, coming out of that. What happened to him in prison, coming out of that. Then, totally changing his persona, everything about himself. And then trying to also figure out what that means. How can he make an impact? Meeting Betty Shabazz, all these things. Those were obviously really important details, but it's watching it now, it's really interesting to see the deliberateness of certain inclusions of his life, and it does feel seamless, but it also, you could, like I said, you could put it into thirds like that, and it's impressive. The locations, the costumes. I think it's Ruth Carter. She's amazing. The score by Terrence Blanchard. It just confirmed, watching all these Spike Lee movies recently, Black Klansman, The Five Bloods, definitely makes me want to, like, kind of revisit stuff like Brooklyn, and Red Hook Summer, and even Clockers, just to get, I feel like I just want to kind of immerse myself in more of his movies, because I'm coming to kind of like a reappreciation of him as an American filmmaker. I mean, it's it's obviously no joke, like I said before, that he's a film geek, a student of film history. He studied under Scorsese. A lot of times Scorsese produced his movies. He was a student along with Oliver Stone in Oliver Stone in, as they were under Scorsese. So it's like it's no surprise, and you see it in his movies. Like a lot of his movies can be epic, but he could also do crazy, quirky comedies too. So it's just it's impressive to watch this now, mainly because of the amount of films that I've watched, since '92. Yeah. So I definitely have an appreciation and respect for it.
Yeah, I mean, no doubt. Was this the movie that he did directly after Do the Right Thing? I don't know if there's anything in between.
I think it had to have been. Well, yeah. There might have been Mo Better. Was Mo Better Blues? Let me look here. I think Mo Better Blues was right after Do the Right Thing.
So is that 90 or 91 then?
Let's see.
Oh.
90.
Okay.
Mo Better Blues is 90.
All right. So regardless, the leap just in scope of filmmaking between those two films and Malcom X is quite impressive. I mean, I'm sure he got a lot of support and fame and accolades, and he was able to use that to get a bigger platform in terms of his ambition. But yeah, I agree. Telling this story, particularly at that moment in time, with opening with the footage of the Rodney King beating, which had happened just the year before. I mean, that was 91. This was the end of 92. Much like with Da 5 Bloods ending, bringing that story in a wraparound to the Black Lives Matter activism, it's uncanny how he seems to be working right at these lightning rod moments, releasing films that kind of put a punctuation on the cultural zeitgeist. Is pretty amazing. I got to just chime in and say, I do agree that Denzel Washington's performance is transformative. It's eerie because he gets during that third where it really is about him being Malcolm X. Yeah. A lot of it is speech montage, but it is never boring. And it's interesting to hear what he's talking about. Whether or not you actually agree with it, it's hard not to get swept up in it. Now, I'd got to know, do either of you know who won Best Actor in 1993 or whatever it was?
I wanted to do some research on that beforehand, but I didn't have time.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
It's probably not important. But it is, it's one of those rare performances that sort of defies what a performance is, because I'm with you. I look at Denzel Washington as, I guess, what you might consider his normal kind of suave leading man, cool disposition. And you get some of that here, particularly in the front half of the movie, where he's trying to be this kind of a smooth player character. But then to go into a completely conservative mode with these bursts of the firebrand passion when he's preaching, the word of Elijah Muhammad and trying to grow the Nation of Islam all over America, it's remarkable. And you almost can't place or can't put the two versions of Malcolm Little that you see in this movie. I mean, technically there's three, at the very end, right, but they almost don't match up at all, which goes back to, I think he was telling at one point the story of, Saul's conversion to Paul. And I imagine that is, sort of a thematic thread, if you will, because it is an utter spiritual and physical transformation that he goes to.
Right.
And one of the things that struck me is, my dad took me to see this movie in '92. I think largely because I was fascinated by the dynamic that I absorbed through pop culture, starting with Do the Right Thing. This idea that you had two sides of the civil rights activism coin. You had Martin Luther King, who was, the peaceful, like, let's march. Even in there's a clip in this movie where he says, if you're planning to get violent, don't get in the line to come to the protest. And then on the other side of that coin, you had Malcolm X, who was the militant, by any means necessary, we're going to, tear down the system and, or we're going to create our own system and basically defect back to Africa and create a more perfect world. That was the conception that I had of these two men. Watching Malcolm X, I had no idea that he had this conversion at the very end of his life. And that's where I kind of question, I don't know, maybe it is that he came back from Mecca and within like a couple of weeks he was getting to make that speech at the Audubon room where he was assassinated. I don't know if there was a longer period or if it really was that brief, but it's sad that I think a lot of people, particularly, for general shorthand, I'll just call them white people, still have this conception of Malcolm X as the militant, like anti-white person. That last chapter in his life, I don't think gets talked about enough because he really was trying to discover a way forward for, all peoples based essentially on that experience he had in Mecca, going to, figure out his faith because of what he perceived, I think rightfully so, as a betrayal within the nation, to try and find himself in the face of his God, and finding that when he went to the source of that, he was worshiping along with, people of multiple ethnicities. They all got along, they all respected each other. So this sort of thing that had been ingrained in him, this racism from birth, when he had, Klansmen firebombing his house, because his father was also, sort of a black liberation preacher, it really changed the way that he saw things. And I think he was very confused at the end and open to discovering a new world. Unfortunately, the other interests that were sort of aligned against him didn't make that possible. He is also one of the few people, when we talk about black leaders of the 60s, who was, assassinated by black people. This wasn't a case of he was being, he's taken out by a white racist. So that's fascinating as well. I think that if anything, that's sort of where I place we're in the middle of all this protest and this activism now. So it is hard to make any kind of prediction that will stick or any kind of assessment that won't, possibly look dumb 2 days from now or 2 years from now. But in the national conversation that's going on, the division between, say, Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter as slogans and catchphrases, it can seem on both sides to be very divisive, a very divisive and a very dicey proposition. Because I know All Lives Matter is a very problematic term, but I also know that there is a lot of dialogue, particularly from people that I know who are people of color. There's a frustration, and I understand it, of it's Black Lives Matter. We've been saying this for years. We're trying to get everybody on board to focus on this particular issue. There's a frustration now in the wake of the George Floyd death that All Lives Matter is no longer okay. It's sort of off the table. You need to be on board with Black Lives Matter, and we're moving forward. There are a lot of people, I think, find that to be sort of troubling because they are good-hearted people who still just haven't come around to it. They don't understand. And the conversation seems to be, we're tired of trying to explain it, just get on board. And so when we're talking about a figure like Malcolm X, it feels like there is that level of frustration with a very single-minded focus on the message that he was preaching, that he very much believed in, based on a history of racism and what had been done to his people, to African Americans all over the nation for 400 years. But there was another perspective that he just had not, gotten on board with, which sort of changed the way that he conceived of, racial unity and the possibility of even getting along with the people that he viewed as the oppressor. So that's just, where that's what I was thinking about while I was watching this. And again, I don't know if this is pertinent or if it would even hold up to scrutiny now or in the near future, but it was just on my mind.
So is there a question there, or
there's a lot on your mind there?
Yeah, well,
are you wondering, like, what would Malcolm say in today's world, or
like
if I don't hadn't have been assassinated, or
I don't know. I mean, that's the That is the funny thing, because I wonder what kind of a leader he would have, been. I mean, we kind of talked about in the Five Bloods when we were talking about
Delroy Lindo's character, or
no, I'm totally blanking on what was the name of the character they went back to find.
Storm and Norman.
Storm and Norman, yes.
It rhymes. How could you forget it?
No, it was on the tip of my tongue. But Storm and Norman, we talked about how he was sort of an inspirational black leader and a voice of reason to the very strong emotions to that group, sure. And he was snuffed out, right around that same time period.
Right.
And the kind of the dearth of black leaders that they could turn to in those intervening years, they kind of had to rely on each other during that journey. I do wonder what Malcolm X would have thought about these times, if maybe his conversion would have been short-lived and he would have gone back to more militancy. No one can know. But
hard to say.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's an impossible question. I understand.
I would say the same. I would wonder about what MLK would think about today, or what they would both think about today. Watching that third act. That third act could be a movie in and of itself, because that's an interesting time. If you started a movie at the point where Malcolm is frustrated with the Honorable Elijah. He said it so many times. I'm like, wow, just give him an Oscar. Just give him an Oscar for saying that.
I thought his first name was
Honorable Elijah Muhammad.
Yes.
He was born with the first name Honorable. When he became frustrated with following Honorable Elijah Muhammad and went to Mecca, you could start the movie with that and then just go through the time in Mecca. And as he comes back, it's really interesting. I thought about, since I recently rewatched Selma, I thought about that moment in Selma where Malcolm X showed up. And I was wondering, did that take place before or after he went to Mecca? I'm thinking after, right? Had to have been. Because he was coming to Martin Luther King to basically work with him.
Yeah.
And I think that was...
I want to say it was after. Because before they were kind of...
Yeah,
there was a little friction.
Growing up reading X-Men comics, it was always Malcolm X was Magneto, and MLK was Professor X. So, they came... It was interesting how Ava DuVernay included that moment. I don't know the historic moments and if that actually occurred, or if that was for dramatic effect that Malcolm X actually came to Selma.
I would hazard to guess that if it did take place, it would have been after his conversion, because in this film, I don't think he mentions King directly when he's saying this, but he is talking about there are certain leaders in the black movement who are pacifists, and they're not they're advocating nonviolence, and he didn't quite agree with that.
It would make sense, because so having recently rewatched Selma and then watching this, there's that time period when he comes back from Mecca, and I just feel like maybe there had to have been more going on between returning to Mecca and the Audubon ballroom scene. More by more time, I mean maybe more speeches, more interaction with others, more moments in time of him trying to bring together people. Mm-hmm. So I was looking at that time where he approached Martin Luther King's wife in Selma, that had to have been part of that. So again, like I said, there's a whole lot of movie, and it took a lot of you had to make a lot of decisions to include certain things. And I do think it flows very well. It's just that you tend to wonder at times, okay, is there more going on here? Was there more happening? Is it just that for time's sake we had to move on? I know that Betty Shabazz was involved in kind of like used as a reference for this movie, a consultant rather. I think I read somewhere where she had a bit of an issue with that whole scene where there was an argument at home between her and Malcolm X. She said that she's like, we never really had arguments. I just got on board and supported him. But, that's the movies, right? It's for dramatic effect, It's what Denzel's good at, right? I taking all that into consideration, I briefly read Ebert's review of this movie, at least the first paragraph, and right after I watched this. And this movie, he's kind of basically going into like how this movie is a lot of things, but one of the things that a movie like this succeeds in doing is being entertaining. It is an entertaining movie, but it is also this odd thing that it's entertaining but also hard hitting and enlightening, moving, and educational. There's a lot of teachable things here, and I almost envy people who like their first Spike Lee movie is Da 5 Bloods, because it's like if you don't know these Spike Lee-isms and you watch Da 5 Bloods, like I was recently watching an Instagram Live with Spike and Snoop Dogg. And they were going crazy, like just accolading each other, and they were all geeking out about each other. But one of the things that he was mentioning is that he's like, hey, Snoop, a lot of people think that the end of Da 5 Bloods, I like added that Black Lives Matter stuff in. He's like, I didn't. It's like people think that because it's this time in history right now that he just tacked that on. If you watch Malcolm X, this has been on his mind all his life.
Yeah.
And it is interesting. Like I said, it's interesting. It's like if Da 5 Bloods is your first Spike Lee movie, go to Malcolm X next. Because it's like you're basically seeing a lot of the things as far as structure and the kind of style and inclusion that is present in Da 5 Bloods. It's all you could also find in Malcolm X. Malcolm X is his epic opus for sure, just for sheer length, but also it's as impressive as say an epic like Lawrence of Arabia or Dr. Zhivago or something like that. It's just that massive and of an undertaking, but also highly impressive and successful. But it is interesting to see that this has been what Spike was about all along. It's continuing. Again, like I mentioned in Da 5 Bloods, he's not a subtle director, but there's nothing wrong with that. Because the subtleties, just like Da 5 Bloods, the subtleties can be found in the performers in Malcolm X.
Yeah, I think, this is and I have not seen all of Spike Lee's movies. I've seen a handful of them, but this struck me, particularly watching it again this weekend, as the most straightforward of his movies, as far as like in Da 5 Bloods, where we've got characters giving these sort of mini history lessons, and you've got pop-up photographs of people and clips and things. There's not a whole lot of that in here. I think it's more in the artistic flourishes, like the Klan riding off into the night against that giant moon. It's like it's an incredibly impressive and horrific image. And the scene where his dad gets run over by the streetcar, we keep flashing back to that scene. The other thing that I noticed, and I don't know if you guys hooked into that the shotgun blast audio motif that pops up 6 times in the movie. Did you catch this?
I noticed it a couple of times.
Yeah.
It was almost at times it's almost just a sound of transition. I think, and then obviously the shotgun blast, from his assassination, but.
Okay.
Yeah, but I think that there was, I noticed a couple different transitions. There were shotgun blasts.
Yeah, I wrote these down. I think I noticed this when I watched it, as a kid. I'm like, odd. But again, like you said, David, you watch something with a 25-year gap, you're more mature as a person, also a student of film. But yeah, it's in the first one I noticed was when Shorty and Malcolm X are kind of playing cops and robbers in the park, in the suits.
Yes.
They're shooting each other. You hear a distinct gunshot. You're like, what is that?
And it's not addressed.
Right. Delroy Lindo, his kind of gangster character, he does some finger guns during one scene, and it's actually you hear a gunshot. When he's leaving a press conference towards the end, you hear it. There's one other instance that I forgot to write down, but I remember it. And then the last two, he's sort of like doubling up on the rule of three. The last two are the two shotgun blasts that he gets to the chest before they come and finish him off with the handguns. And also, I want to ask you this, something that I caught the first time I watched it, and again, did it appear that Denzel gave the slightest grin to the guy who shot him at the end, like right before he got shot?
Yeah,
I saw that, and I think what the impression that I was getting, because the weird thing is, you're watching this, what's gonna happen,
sure.
And, because it's going to happen, it's a lot easier to pay attention to more subtle things, rather than being shocked, in that moment. And I saw that, but not only that, I also saw, or I started paying more attention to, Denzel or Malcolm's state of mind, like how, just the subtleties that he was trying to portray. And it almost reminded me of Christ's final days, where it's just like all this stress, but at the same time I
peace.
know like there's a sense of peace, like I know this thing is going to happen, or at least have this trepidation, this fear, this anxiety that is going to happen, but I still need to be peaceful in the same sense. And whether the real Malcolm knew that was his last day or not, in this movie you kind of get the impression that he knows this, especially when he's giving all of his friends and security people all these different
responsibilities.
Yeah. He's like, no, go call him again. And it's kind of like, wait a minute, like that's not what I do.
Yeah.
So, it was almost like, no, Malcolm kind of had this premonition or a sense or whatever. But yeah, so when the smile came, or when the smirk came, the way I interpreted it was confirmation. I knew this was going to happen. There it is. But at the end of the day, because of the transformation Malcolm started to experience in the latter part of his life, I also felt like it was like an I love you, like to my brother, to my African Americans, family, brothers out there, like, I love you. I know you're doing this because of hate or whatever, but maybe even I forgive you, but that was kind of what I grabbed in that quick microsecond of a smirk. But it was a sense of like just closure too, I guess.
Yeah.
It was funny. Well, not funny, but it was, I wound up remembering that like the whole time I was watching this movie, I was like almost kicking myself, like, why have I waited this long to watch this movie? But at the same time, like I said, I was glad that I did. But that moment in the Abaddon ballroom, I was like, I've seen this whole sequence before. It's like, I don't know, for some reason, I remember seeing that whole assassination scene, and I mean the choreography on that is crazy. It is, yeah. It's, I think Twyla Tharp was involved. I could be wrong, but yeah, it was just. I know she must have been involved in the dance scenes in the beginning, but yeah, just the editing and the timing of everything, and I mean the emotional shock of the fact that his whole family was there. Yet, like you guys are saying, I mean there is this kind of like peace that he was conveying, and I'm really interested in like learning more about the decision to convey that. And I think it is a lot of what you guys are saying, just this whole communication of acknowledgement and love. And because, you know, like, it's frustrating that he was cut down when he was, because I think he was on his way to just another enlightened plane in life. You know?
Well, and it's funny you guys mentioned that, because, you know, earlier you guys were talking about Martin Luther King Jr. He had a similar shift too.
Right.
You know, while a lot of people just like the kumbaya MLK, the latter part of his life is where I would say, you know, that target really started to get put on him, because he started talking about social injustice and socioeconomic issue. He was pushing reparations.
Right.
He was saying a lot of things that at that time people just did not want to hear. So, you know, it was just interesting how both, you know, of these iconic leaders have these shifts that I would say kind of go against what we have, you know, carried on with their images today.
Right. Like what I guess the culture knows them for. Yeah. I mean, I could see them, you know, eventually, you know, working hand in hand.
Sure.
Together. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's you know, you bring up kind of an interesting point there, EMan, especially the idea of Martin Luther King. You know, he was assassinated, you know, within a couple of years of, you know, Malcolm X's death. Yeah. Malcolm X's death. It brings to mind your question, David, of what he could have accomplished had he not been cut down. I wonder if he would have, you know, just been taken out by somebody else, because the late 60s was, you know, or well, just the 60s in general. We lost, you know, both Kennedys, MLK, like everybody who was trying to make some kind of a substantive difference. They were taken out by, by various interests.
Lee Harvey Oswald was gunned down. You know, it's like everybody seemed to be like assassinated and gunned down.
It was the thing to do.
Yeah. And it is really interesting to see. I mean, I know that, you know, obviously you look at like presidential assassinations, you know, Reagan was shot and everything. And it's like, there is this feeling of like, you know, at what point there's, I think if you're a certain age, you look at what's happening and you think at a certain point, it's like, okay, at what point are we going to get to the level of possible assassination here? You know, it's like, because we grew up knowing that stuff, and it's in, you know, our kind of consciousness, our history, that it's just like, we know that it could possibly get to this level. And, you know, I think it's important to have movies like this get details, kind of like leading up to certain, you know, assassinations, because we kind of get a little bit of the behind the scenes, and like you were saying, EMan, it's like, you know, MLK was really starting to stir it up, and, you know, with Malcolm X, you basically have another group of people who just were not liking what he was doing. And I don't know about you guys, but in the movie, that the group that I don't know, there's almost like 8 to 10 people there who were involved in the assassination. It wasn't totally clear to me like who they were a part of.
Yeah.
But, you know, obviously it seems like they could have been part of the Nation of Islam. I'm not sure. Or, you know, they were once followers of Malcolm X and they didn't like where he was going.
I mean, they kind of left that ambiguous, because you know, he had a lot of enemies, and it's hard to say it was just them. I mean, there have been many. I think there's even a Netflix documentary, you know, who shot Malcolm X or who killed Malcolm X, and, you know, the FBI, CIA, you know, a lot of people are on that list. So,
but Was it the FBI or the CIA who were actually filming him in Egypt?
In
Egypt, I think he thought it was the CIA.
Mm-hmm. And that would have been because the FBI is domestic.
Okay, the CIA then.
The FBI were the ones who were recording all of his phones and everything.
Yeah. So pick your flavor.
Yeah, from and I'm not in Spike Lee's head, but the way that this is presented in the film, it is, Malcolm X. Yeah, I don't doubt that he had a lot of enemies, a lot of people with grievances, but the main villain, if you could even call it that, was the Nation of Islam, the people that he was kind of turning his back on once he was disillusioned with them. So the implication, I think, is that they sent this group of assassins. There isn't a whole lot of if Spike Lee, I think, had focused a bit more on some of the other people who were discontented with his message, then I might be able to say it could have been anybody. But I feel like my impression in these 25 years, whatever, has been that it was the work of the prophet. I don't know, that whole dynamic was really interesting, especially with the the corruption and when Malcolm X finds out that Elijah Muhammad had fathered all of these children, he goes and interviews us. He can't believe that his hero would do these things, but he goes and talks to these women, and he believes
Halle Berry.
But he believes all of them, which is kind of unique, because you'd think that, I don't know if they had tried to tell their stories to other people or what they had told the people who were around them as far as who the father was. You'd almost think that they were trying to hush this up and they didn't make a big deal about it. But then Malcolm X, who's like the number 2 guy in the organization, comes to talk to them, and he's totally on board. And yet somehow the apparatus had kept this knowledge from him. It's like you had the prophet's inner circle, and then you had his true inner circle,
right?
That Malcolm X wasn't actually a part of. It was like him and Baines were kind of running the thing.
Those scenes were interesting because I think what hurt him even more was the fact that some of the things that Muhammad was saying about Malcolm X to these women,
right?
And that was like, he said that about me,
right?
And it's like, dang, that cuts even deeper. It's like, but it's not,
And again, this is one of the reasons why I like the fact that we got the totality of Malcolm's life, because I was more interested in how he thought about things, how he approached things. And like I said, even it wasn't until he never had a firm foundation for his own sense of thinking until he went to Mecca. That was the very first time. It wasn't someone else's influence. It wasn't his environment. It was just like, I have a personal revelation. I have found, what do they say? If a man doesn't stand for something, he falls for anything. Sure. He finally found something to stand on rather than to lean on, because he was always leaning on the Nation of Islam. And now he was like, oh, no, I'm still, Muslim and all that, but I see a better path. I see a different path, and that was when he was going to walk. So
like Ian said earlier, that's his Saul Paul moment.
Right.
There's road to Damascus there. And
even though he thought he had that in prison.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
And they even did it with the shiny light and everything.
Right. And it makes sense, because at Mecca, he's away from his followers. He's away from the influences. He's away from his family. Well, he was often away from his family, but he's away from all that, and you're just forced to face with, okay, what do I believe in? And I think it's one of those rare movies where narration is actually helpful. Because yes, it's good to be inside his head, but it's also good to hear Denzel, talk like, I saw not just, black men kneeling together through, 5 times a day, praying. I was side by side with white guys, and it's like, for the first time, in my life, it's like, my mind was open, my whole world was torn apart and renewed, I think that was, like I said before, that could be a movie in and of itself, but I think that yeah, totality is a good word for it, E-Man. I think that this is one of the, if we had to list like a top 5 or top 10 like biopics, I mean, you have to include this movie,
100%.
just because of the sheer breadth of it and where it goes, and all that it involves. It's not really stereotypical in any way. It's not checking any biopic boxes, because it's following his life, and Malcolm X didn't check any boxes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that even extends to, at the end of a lot of these biopics, we get the obligatory, and here's what they really looked like, whether that's a still photo or a couple of scenes. But at the end of this, it is a long sequence. I want to say that's narrated by Ossie Davis, where he's giving the eulogy.
Yeah.
And it's this montage of actual footage from, like home movies and, press footage and clippings and things. It's fascinating because it's not only moving words that we're hearing delivered through another amazing voice, but looking at Malcolm X, he seems very human. I don't know if it's just the HD quality of the Netflix transfer I was watching, but he's got a much kind of softer face and almost kind of a tall, lanky, soft demeanor. You don't get a whole lot of audio visual of him giving these fiery speeches. You get a little bit, but it really draws. Denzel was sort of portraying the man as a myth. And then at the end, we get, real footage of the man who kind of took on these mythical proportions. And it was at that moment, it wasn't even during the assassination or the moments leading up to it, that beautiful, like kind of Jesus in the garden thing in the dressing room that really got me. It was that eulogy that I was a wreck by the end of it. And, talking about contemporary applications, when you've got all those school children standing up saying, I am Malcolm X, then you've got, Nelson Mandela in that classroom, giving that speech. I thought very easily you could contemporize this by having kids, pop up and say, Black Lives Matter, really talking about that legacy carrying forth, and it would have just been just as impactful. That's the first thing I thought of. After the second kid said that, I'm like, oh my God, this is perfect. This is the legacy.
It is interesting to see how Denzel's pretty much gone after that assassination.
Oh yeah,
he's not in the movie.
Yeah,
it's all footage of the actual Malcolm X. There's even Nelson Mandela talking to students. That's important stuff. Anybody who feels like that's tacked on after the assassination is nuts. You're not paying attention. Wake up, as Spike would say. You're really seeing how his life was carried on after his death, and I think Denzel's son is one of the kids in the classroom, John David Washington. I think I was reading something there that I think his son was in that scene. Cool. Interestingly enough, Ossie Davis actually wrote and read Malcolm X's eulogy at his funeral. So that's why I think Spike tapped. Of course, he worked with him and Do the Right Thing too, but that's why I think he included Ossie in that. There's a lot to digest in this movie. There's a lot of interesting behind the scenes information to delve into. I think Louis Farrakhan wanted to totally be excluded from anything because of death threats or whatever. Yeah. It's just there's a movie like this. Like I said, it's a lot of movie, but there's a lot involved. In behind the scenes.
So my question for you guys is because this is touching on like what we talked about earlier, with the public memory of a lot of these figures and how a lot of it is either misinformed or we only know a little bit or whatever the case may be. What do you guys think that people can take from this film and correlate it till today? Because I will admit I'm a little pessimistic on it making a huge impact for today. in today's climate.
Well, I'd like to hear more about your pessimism, but
let's get into that.
Yeah, no problem. I mean,
Yeah.
look, when it comes to history, America as a country is just so
Forgetful?
misinformed. No, we're misinformed. I mean, we have a lot of revisionist history.
Sure.
There's a lot of stuff that's left out. I mean, you can go down the list, whether it's founding fathers, Christopher Columbus, Juneteenth, the Lost Cause with the Confederacy. Like, you can name a lot of stuff that we have accepted in history. And because that's so ingrained, we've never taken the time as a country to reconcile with what actually happened, or to add more nuance with, the fuller picture. And, for me, I'm a little pessimistic in thinking that if someone were to watch Malcolm X today, that they would be able to be like, oh man, now I get it. Now I get that connection as to what was going on back then, and how either it's still happening today in some way, shape, or form, or how these events, impacted today. I'm concerned about, because of how we're conditioned and how we absorb history, as diluted as it's been, if we're able to make that connection today with this movie.
I believe it's possible.
Okay.
I understand your pessimism, believe me.
And I don't want to say it's impossible.
No.
I'm just saying, I don't know if it's going to warm hearts and change minds. That's
No. But I think what this movie does, one of the many things it does is something that, Ian touched on, is just this: it breaks down the myth of Malcolm X and adds humanity to who he was.
For sure.
That's needed. What movies can do is, a lot of times, is provide you with something that you can't get out of a book.
Yeah.
And you hear his voice through an actor. You hear narration. You hear, like even if you were to watch, even if somebody was only to watch the movie after the assassination, powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And that's just clips of Malcolm X, and that's just, seeing how he was impacting, the world. But my hope is that, and I feel like this is happening, that people are really taking an interest in Black culture, Black history. I feel like they want to know more about these towering, powerful figures, like, the big two, MLK and Malcolm X, but also, all sorts of other writers, figures, poets, whoever they come across. I think you start to delve in. Hopefully, you start to delve into whoever inspired who you're currently following. So let's say you watched, like I said, you watched The Five Bloods. Well, what inspired Spike Lee to make a movie like that? Then you start to see, like, well, who inspired Spike Lee? Well, who is he motivated by? Well, who is he listening to? Or, it's like, and so I think that there are people out there who will start to dig deep into that and look at, okay, well, let's check out this, Malcolm X. Let's check out, a lot of people are rewatching Do the Right Thing, lately. And, it's topical, it's relevant. And I think people will go into, like, man, I need to read up on, anti-racism. I need to read up on Black history. I'm seeing that. I mean, I'm doing that, and so I feel like, I hate to use the term woke, but, there is I think if you don't have a period in your life, on your life journey, of being awakened and doing something about it. We talk about, Saul turning into Paul, talk about Malcolm X's transition. Their wokenness would be nothing if they didn't act upon it. And I think if there's certain things that people are seeing in today that gives them something to question, gives them something to think about, if they leave it at that, what good is that? But they have to actually act upon that. And whether that's, as far as acting upon it, that could be a peaceful march, peaceful protest. That could be reading up on certain things and educating yourself and engaging with others, building a dialogue where there was no previous dialogue with people who don't look like you. I think that's within the realm of optimism and hopeful progress. But then again, I do understand your pessimism.
Yeah, and that's a lot. Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful. I mean, these are very troubling and dark and weird times that we're living in, and it's not going to get any easier in the next 5 months as the country essentially decides what the next 4 years are going to look like in either direction. There is such deep-rooted division, even before George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, COVID-19, we were already rocky, and this has just sort of ignited, he's thrown kerosene onto this, campfire. I don't know what the solution is. I think it's very telling. Malcolm X is a more optimistic film than Do the Right Thing. Do the Right Thing ends on an ambiguous note of the possibility of unity between the races. Right. There's Sal's gets, burned to the ground, and you think that's it. But then at the end, as we kind of talked about, Mookie and Sal have that exchange where they're very clearly mad at each other, but it ends in a stalemate where they're both like, yeah, it's supposed to be hot again today. And then they both, Mookie's like, I got to go get paid. Malcolm X ends with that beautiful juxtaposition on Spike Lee's part where Ossie Davis is finishing his eulogy. I don't have the exact line, but it's essentially talking about the legacy of Malcolm X and what he learned in his transformation and carrying that, hope into the future. And then it ends with that clip that is often construed as a more militant, activist call to activism, where he says, by any means necessary. But in placing that at that moment, at the end of that speech, it's pretty much saying you've got to stand up and you've got to do what's right for America and for the world, but we have to do it together. I think that's something that people are trying to figure out right now, but emotions are still so raw. My biggest fear is that this is going to die down in some capacity, and there's going to be another big scare, whether it's, oh my God, it's COVID wave 2 that's going to extinguish the
attack or something.
Terrorist attack. Yeah. And I'm not getting conspiracy minded. I'm talking about the nil attention span of the population. That's what I'm pessimistic about. It's not racial disharmony per se, right?
I share that concern.
So who knows? Again, what I was saying earlier about my, probably poorly worded, assessment of, BLM versus, ALM, if that's even a thing.
I guess
it's not a thing.
Don't make it a thing.
It's not a thing.
Yeah. Alms for the poor. No. But what I'm saying is we're in a moment right now. It's a cliche that we're living through history. We're always living through history, but this is going to be something that if we're not a smoldering ash heap by the year 2021, people will be writing about and studying and dissecting for the next 50 years. So I'm not going to make any predictions, but I am going to remain hopeful because otherwise we might as well just take ourselves out to the woodshed and be done with it.
Wow. Okay.
So, EMan, does that answer your question?
It does. I mean, it does. I mean, look, there's a lot to think about, when you're watching this movie, because I don't know if I would have had the same takeaways from this movie had I watched it last year. Heck, 4 months ago, if that. So, I don't want to feel jaded per se, but there's a lot going on, in the outside world that will fuel, worldviews and opinions and stuff. So, when you watch it today, maybe, when you watch it 10 years from now, there's some different understanding that we gain from it. But for the time being, it's just one of those movies that I'm glad it was made, and like I said, I wish more biopics would be like this. I like to see the fullness of people. I don't like to see the mythology, because I think that when you build up mythology or myths around people, the second you learn, the truth, it almost takes everything else away.
Right.
I mean, like I said, I watched Lincoln, fantastic movie.
Mm-hmm.
But when I took my college African American courses, and let's just say I got a brand new look on Lincoln, the person, because that's not what the movie portrays. Very, very disturbing. So, I do believe that movies carry that special something, that David was talking about, that, they do give you something that will be not only informative, but lasting, mentally.
Right.
I mean, to this day, I'll admit it, I still think Moses is Charlton Heston. I mean, I'm not,
not Russell Crowe?
No.
That was Noah. That was Noah.
He's Noah.
Oh, you're right. I'm getting my Bible characters mixed up.
But yeah, I'm just saying, like, that's unfortunately the byproduct of living in a world where, we consume all this information that is not always from textbooks, but, movies, you're talking about audio, visual, stimulation and stuff. They can make a lasting impression. So when they get it right, or at least give the appearance that it's right and authentic, that's appreciated.
So guys, who won Best Actor that year?
Don't tell me.
Was it?
Here's a clue.
Was it Silence of the Lambs?
Here's a clue. No, that was the year before.
Okay.
Here's a clue. Hoo-ha!
That was Scent of a Woman?
Yep. Al Pacino.
No. And I love Al. I love me some Al. But
man, that performance.
No.
Yeah.
And I that was it. No.
Wow.
No.
Wow.
Can we do redos? Can they do redos? No? Too late? Okay.
No. Sorry, you broke my brain with that.
I'm sure there's got to be a book out there about how many times Oscar didn't get it right.
I want to say if it was Anthony Hopkins for Silence of the Lambs,
it wasn't.
Then I'm just saying, like, if it was, then I'd be like, well,
okay,
like it might have been close, but come on now. Okay,
that's rough.
I wonder what the circumstances were. Like, was this one of those we owe him? So we got to give it to him. I mean, I don't know. I was too young at the time, but I just wonder if those external, kind of like with Leo, and The Revenant.
It's so crazy that this movie wasn't even nominated for Best Picture.
Right. I noticed that, and I was like, what's going on?
He had Unforgiven, The Crying Game, A Few Good Men, Howard's End, Scent of a Woman.
Good movies, too. Good movies, but you guys couldn't squeeze one more? Okay.
Well, back then it was just 5, but
yeah.
That's still a damn travesty, man.
Yeah. Yep.
But yeah, I will say one of the things that makes Malcom X such a great biopic is that it makes you want to go out and read the source material and find out what the real story was and how closely it aligned. I'm assuming that because Spike Lee, he was a big fan of the man and what he represented, and also got the Shabazz family involved, that they had some level of approval, or like, this is close enough to the mark where we can say we sign off on this.
Right.
So I would doubt that there's a whole lot of license taken that I would read the book and be like, well, that was clearly false.
Yeah.
Right.
But in terms of what you're talking about, EMan and the hopefulness, I think if people do latch onto this, and again, Netflix is highlighting a whole bunch of these movies for people to check out. If they do watch it and they sit through the entire thing, and I don't want to get into like stuff about millennial attention spans, but if they get through it and they're interested enough to go and read up on history, I think that's what we're all trying to get at here.
I would love that. I would love that.
Yeah.
to me, I just don't know if this is the movie to do it. Like, I just think movies that are set in more current time frames can be a little bit more accessible in trying to help people make these type of connections. So like The Hate U Give, that's something that, it's, fictional or whatever, but it could happen.
The other one, what, Blind Spotting?
Blind Spotting, just things like that. I just feel like because of, yes, my generation's short, attention span, it would help because I think what ends up happening is we get so caught up in, but that was so long ago, that was in the 60s. I think it becomes easier for people to dismiss it as being relevant. So,
And I think that's the danger though, too, is because you need people who know their history.
100%.
And even though what you were talking about, revisionist history and multiple interpretations, they say history is written by the winners, and it's largely, white people who've been writing it from a very narrow perspective for all these, centuries. You do have to do some digging, and you have to do a lot of homework. And that's where I think the real activism is going to come into play. If you really care about this stuff and you really want to make a difference and figure out how to talk to people with facts, you've got to do some, reading, some listening to podcasts, some, watching movies and really digging into this. Otherwise, you're going to get, the points of view, sort of like the history that we're talking about, of people who perhaps have agendas or ideas that they want to advance, that, maybe there's some better ideas or better ways of communicating or perspectives from history that you could apply today instead of believing, well, history began in 2013.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, there is no zeitgeist with all this because it's always been around. And so I think, like you said, I think it'll be good for people to see current movies, but man, if they want to go deeper, watching something like this, or even Selma, Spike Lee's documentary, Four Little Girls, holy cow, you will see that this isn't anything new, unfortunately. Right. And I think that history does, tend. I mean, it can, depending on how it's told, it can definitely inform and enlighten.
Yeah. Well, I think this has been a very informative and enlightening discussion, even though we talked a bit about Malcom X, the movie. But no, I appreciate it, guys, and thanks for talking about this with me. I'm sure we'll be talking about other movies, but this trilogy that we've completed, I feel like has been very important conversations to have, and I hope to see more of these, not just from us, but from everyone, because that's what we need is people openly engaging, not being afraid to be vulnerable in this time.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks again.
Up next, Girl 6. Oh no, sorry.
Which I've not seen.
I've not seen it either.
Oh well, hey, there you go. In fairness, I still need time to catch up on Girl 1 through 5. But no. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to do the YouTube thing. Thank you for watching, everyone. If you've hung on this long, be sure and check out EMan's movie reviews, Keeping It Real, and also smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you do like this content. If you've got thoughts, and I'm sure you do, on the many different things that we've discussed tonight, please leave them in the comment section, and someone will return your message. Hopefully some witty repartee or insight. So thanks again, gang, and have a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.